I'll never see 30, so I sing like I'm already dead. Most people in Jacksonville look at the sunset and see a postcard. I look at that bleeding horizon and see a finish line I've been sprinting towards since the day I realised a man's ribs are just a cage for a heart that's too loud to stay quiet. My father, Lacy, taught me two things before I could even read: how to bleed without crying, and how to hit back hard enough to make the other guy forget why he started the fight. In the Van Zant house, mercy wasn't a virtue. It was a weakness you outgrew or had beaten out of you. I was born in 1948, right in the sweltering, mosquito-ridden armpit of Florida they call Jacksonville. It's a city built on asphalt, timber, and the kind of heavy, wet heat that makes your temper boil before the clock even strikes noon. My father, Lacy Van Zant, wasn't a man of many words, but he had a set of knuckles that spoke a language everyone understood. In his youth, he had been a prizefighter, a brawler who earned his bread by standing in the centre of a ring and refusing to fall. He didn't just raise my brothers and me, he forged us. He didn't want sons. He wanted soldiers who could survive a world that didn't give a damn about them. I remember the backyard of our house on the west side. The grass was always half dead, parched by the sun, and the air smelled like Georgia pines and diesel exhaust. Lacy would stand there, his shadow long and imposing, and tell us to put up our hands. "Ronnie," he'd say, his voice like gravel grinding together, "the world is going to throw hooks at you that you won't see coming. You can't stop the punch, but you can decide if you're going to stay on the canvas or spit out the blood and stand back up." He'd hit us. Not because he was a mean man, though he could be, but because he was a realist. He wanted to make us scary. He believed that if a Van Zant was in the room, everyone else should feel just a little bit smaller. I learned to tuck my chin, to lean into the pain, and to find that white-hot spark of anger that makes a man dangerous. I wasn't just a kid. I was a weapon being tempered in the fire of a prize fighter's expectations. Those early bruises weren't just injuries, they were medals. They taught me that the only thing you truly own in this life is your dignity and your ability to defend it. But the real schooling, the kind that got under my skin and stayed there, happened inside the cab of his 10-wheeler truck. Lacy spent his days hauling freight across the south, and I spent a good chunk of my childhood sitting in that passenger seat. The seat was made of cracked, sun-baked vinyl that bit into the back of my legs, and the dashboard was always sticky with spilled coffee and fine grey dust. The engine groaned like a beast in labour, a constant, low-frequency roar that vibrated through my bones and made my teeth ache. Inside that cab, the air was thick, heavy with the scent of Lacy's unfiltered cigarettes, stale sweat, and the metallic tang of oil. We'd drive for hours through the Florida backroads, passing swamps where the trees looked like skeletons draped in moss. Lacy would keep his eyes on the road, his massive, scarred hands gripping the wheel like he was trying to choke the life out of it. To anyone else, it was just a job. To me, it was a tour of a world that felt like a beautiful, terrifying trap. I looked at the shipyards and the factories passing by and felt a knot tightening in my stomach. I didn't want to be the man driving the truck. I didn't want my legacy to be a set of calloused hands and a pension for 40 years of silence. Then, Lacy would reach out and turn the knob on the radio. That radio was my first taste of freedom. In the middle of those long, silent halls, music would bleed through the static, like a signal from another planet. It wasn't the polished, sugary stuff they played for the city folk. It was the blues. It was a country. It was the sound of people who lived exactly like we did. Hard, fast, and always one paycheck away from disaster. I remember the first time I heard a slide guitar. It sounded like a woman screaming in the dark, a high, lonesome wail that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Listen to that, boy," Lacy would grumble. "Hut ham ve fia kailoa." That's a man telling the truth. You can lie with your mouth until you're blue in the face, but you can't lie with a melody. If you don't feel it in your gut, it ain't music. It's just noise. I'd sit there, mesmerised by the voices of men like Muddy Waters or Hank Williams. Their songs weren't about peace and love or flowers in your hair. They were about the grit under your fingernails, the whiskey in your glass, and the crushing weight of being alive in a place that didn't care if you lived or died. I realised then that music was the only way out of the cage. If I could sing, if I could capture the roar of that truck engine and the sting of Lacy's fists in a lyric, I wouldn't have to haul freight for the rest of my life. I wouldn't have to be just another ghost on the west side. I remember one night, we were driving back from a run near the Georgia line. The sun was setting, turning the sky the colour of a fresh bruise, deep purple and angry red. A song came on, something with a heavy, driving beat that seemed to sync up with the rhythm of the tyres hitting the seams in the highway. I started tapping my foot on the floorboard, my heart racing. Lacy looked over at me, his face illuminated by the green, ghostly glow of the dashboard lights. "You got rhythm, Ronnie, but rhythm doesn't mean anything without heart. You gotta have the stomach to say what other people are too scared to whisper. You gotta be the one who stands up when everyone else is sitting down." I looked back at him, and for the first time, I didn't see my father as a jailer or a fighter. I saw him as a man who had his own songs trapped inside him, songs he'd never get to sing because he was too busy keeping us fed and clothed. I felt a surge of something fierce and desperate. I was going to sing for both of us. I was going to take every hit he ever gave me, every mile he ever drove, and I was going to turn it into a roar that would shake the foundations of every barroom and stadium in the South. "I'm going to have a band, Pop," I said, my voice cracking but steady. "A real band. We're going to be louder than this truck. We're going to be the best thing this city has ever seen." Lacy just leaned back, exhaled a thick cloud of smoke, and watched the headlights cut through the dark. "Then you'd better start practicing, because if you're going to be loud, you'd better be right. The world doesn't have room for a loud-mouthed failure, and a Van Zant doesn't go out like a coward." That was the moment the Mississippi Kid was born, even if I was still just a Florida boy with dirt under my fingernails and a head full of dreams. I understood that the discipline Lacy taught me in the backyard, the iron hand philosophy, wasn't just for fighting. It was for the music. I would run my band like he ran his truck, with no room for error, no patience for weakness, and a relentless bone-deep drive toward the next horizon. I started writing lines in my head that day. I watched the white lines on the highway flicker by like the pages of a book I was just beginning to write. I realised that the bruises on my body would heal, but the fire the music lit in my soul was never going to go out. I wasn't a hippie, and I sure as hell wasn't a poet in a silk shirt. I was a survivor. I was a fighter. And I was coming for everything they said a kid from Jacksonville couldn't have. As we pulled into our driveway in the grey, unforgiving light of dawn, Lacy killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, making my ears ring. He looked at me, his eyes tired but sharp as a razor. "You ready to get back to work?" he asked. "Yeah, Pop," I replied, stepping out of the cab. "But not the kind you think." I hopped down onto the gravel, the soles of my boots crunching against the earth. I could still hear the radio echoing in my head, a ghost melody that promised me a life beyond the shipyards and the truck routes. I walked toward the house, my fists clenched, my head held high. I had the blood of a fighter in my veins and the soul of a singer in my chest. Jacksonville wasn't big enough to hold me anymore. That morning I realised my father hadn't been teaching me how to fight other men. He'd been teaching me how to fight the silence of a forgotten life. Every punch I took was a lesson in endurance, and every mile on that truck was a lesson in perspective. I was no longer just Lacy's son. I was the voice of every man who ever bled in the dark and had no one to sing his story. The road was open, and I was finally ready to take the wheel. If you want to know what Lynyrd Skynyrd sounds like, you have to understand the smell of stagnant swamp water, the taste of cheap wine, and the feeling of sweat turning into a second skin. We didn't learn to play in air-conditioned studios or fancy conservatories. We learned in a shack that was so hot, so cramped, and so loud that the neighbours thought we were summoning the devil himself. They called it Hellhouse. For us, it was the only heaven we were ever going to get. It started with a group of kids who had nothing but restless legs and a shared hatred for anyone who told us to pipe down. I was just a teenager when I met Gary Rossington and Bob Burns. We were barely 13. 14 years old, scrawny, long-haired misfits with guitars that cost less than a good pair of boots. We weren't a band yet. We were just a noise looking for a shape. We tried practicing in our parents' garages on the west side of Jacksonville, but that didn't last long. In a neighbourhood where people worked the night shift, a drum kit and a cranked-up amplifier are better than a death threat for getting you evicted. My mother, Marion, was a saint. But even her patience had a ceiling. After one too many complaints from the folks next door about the racket coming from the garage, we knew we had to go. We needed a place where we could be ugly, where we could be loud, and where no one could hear us scream. We found it out in Green Cove Springs. It was a tiny, one-story cabin tucked away on a creek, surrounded by towering cypress trees and the kind of thick, tangled brush that hides things the world wants to forget. It sat right on the edge of the water, a rickety wooden structure that looked like it would collapse if the wind blew too hard. There were no neighbours for miles, just the bullfrogs, the water moccasins, and the heavy, suffocating silence of the Florida woods. I walked into that shack, looked at the peeling paint and the warped floorboards, and I smiled. "This is it," I told the boys. "This is where we become the best damn band in the South." We didn't call it Hellhouse because of some occult nonsense. We called it that because it was a literal furnace. This was Florida in the dead of summer. There was no air conditioning. There were barely any windows that worked. We'd cram 5 or 6 guys into that tiny living room with all our gear, marshals, drums, cables snaking across the floor like vipers, and we'd play. Within 10 minutes, the temperature would hit 100 degrees. Within 20, the walls would start to sweat. I can still smell it if I close my eyes. It was a cocktail of stale beer, wet dog, and the salt of 5 men working themselves to the bone. We'd play until our fingers bled, until Gary's guitar strings were rusted from the moisture in the air, and until Bob was so dehydrated he looked like a ghost behind the kit. I'd stand in the middle of that heat, barefoot on the wooden slats, my shirt stuck to my back, barking orders like a drill sergeant. Again, I'd say, even after we'd played the same riff 50 times, "It's sloppy. Do it again." I wasn't being mean. I was being Lacy's son. I knew that the world didn't want us to succeed. We were just poor kids from the west side. To the rest of Jacksonville, we were nothing. To the music industry, we were a joke. The only way we were going to win was to be so tight, so disciplined, and so powerful that no one could look away. I turned that shack into a laboratory. We'd practice for 10 to 12 hours a day. We didn't have a social life. We didn't have girlfriends who stuck around for long. We just had the house. I remember Gary looking at me one afternoon, his face red from the heat, his hair matted to his forehead. "Ronnie, man, it's too hot. I can't feel my hands." I didn't hug him. I didn't tell him it was okay. I walked over to the cooler, grabbed a lukewarm bottle of water, poured it over his head, and pointed back at his Gibson. "Your hands don't need to feel," I told him. "They just need to play. If you can play in this heat, you can play anywhere. Now, from the top." We lived on bologna sandwiches and whatever cheap whiskey we could scrounge up. We were outcasts, even in our own town. The respectable folks in Jacksonville hated us. They saw our long hair and our loud cars, and they saw trouble. They didn't see the work. They didn't see the hours we spent perfecting the 3-guitar attack that would one day become our signature. They just heard the distant thud of the drums echoing across the creek and wished we'd disappear. But the more they hated us, the closer we got. Inside Hellhouse, we weren't just a band, we were a gang. We were a family of choice, bound together by the sweat and the struggle. We'd sit on the porch during breaks, watching the sun sink into the swamp, listening to the cicadas compete with the ringing in our ears. Those were the moments when the songs started to breathe. We'd talk about the things we'd seen on the road, the girls we'd lost, and the anger we carried. I started to realise that the heat of Hellhouse was doing something to our sound. It was making it lean. It was stripping away all the fluff and the fancy trimmings. When you're playing in a 100-degree room, you don't play extra notes just for the hell of it. You play what matters. You play the bone and the marrow. Our music became a reflection of that shack, rough, unpolished, and dangerously honest. The neighbours, even the ones miles away, eventually started calling the cops. They'd complain about the noise, the long-haired freaks, and the general sense of rebellion that radiated from the woods. I remember a deputy pulling up one evening, looking at us like we were something he'd found under a rock. "You boys need to keep it down," he said, hand resting on his holster. "People are trying to sleep." I looked him right in the eye, my feet caked in Florida mud, my voice calm but hard. "We aren't making noise, officer. We're making a living, and we aren't stopping until we're done." He didn't like that. But he couldn't stop us. We had a permit for the place, and as long as we stayed on our side of the creek, there wasn't much he could do but scowl. That defiance fueled us. Every time someone told us to stop, we played louder. Every time a neighbour cursed our names, we wrote a better chorus. Hellhouse was our purgatory. It was the place where we burned away our childhood and became men. It was where we learned that talent is nothing without the will to suffer for it. We weren't hippies looking for enlightenment. We were labourers. We were the working man's band, and our factory was a rotting shack in the middle of a swamp. By the time we finally left Green Cove Springs to take our show on the road, we were a different animal. We were hungry, we were tight, and we were fearless. We had survived the heat, the isolation, and the hatred of the world. We had turned a house of hell into a temple of rock and roll. I'll never forget the last day we spent there. We packed up the gear, the air finally cooling as a thunderstorm rolled in from the Gulf. I stood in the doorway of the empty living room, looking at the sweat stains on the floorboards and the cigarette burns on the walls. I could still hear the ghost of a riff echoing in the corners. "We're ready," I whispered to the empty room. Looking back, those were the hardest days of my life, but they were also the purest. In that sweltering shack, we discovered that the world's hate was just fuel for our fire. We didn't need a fancy stage or a cheering crowd to know we were great. We had each other, we had the music, and we had the bone-deep knowledge that if we could survive Hellhouse, we could survive anything the road had to throw at us. We walked out of those woods, not as kids, but as a force of nature. If you want to spark a revolution, you don't need a manifesto or a political party. Sometimes all you need is a jar of Vaseline and a gym teacher with a god complex. In the halls of Robert E. Lee High School, hair wasn't just protein and follicles. It was a battleground. And the man leading the charge against us was a flat-topped, whistle-blowing enforcer named Lynyrd Skynyrd. He thought he was teaching us discipline. Instead, he gave us the greatest revenge in the history of rock and roll: immortality. Jacksonville in the late 60s was a strange place to be a long-haired boy. To the administration at Robert E. Lee High, we weren't just students. We were a moral contagion. They had these strict codes. Hair couldn't touch the collar, sideburns couldn't pass the earlobe, and if you looked too much like a British invader, you were out. But for us, that hair was our flag. It was the only thing we owned that told the world we weren't going to spend our lives working in the shipyards or driving trucks like our fathers. Enter Lynyrd Skynyrd. He was the physical education teacher, a man who moved with the rigid authority of a drill sergeant and possessed an uncanny ability to spot a stray lock of hair from across a crowded gymnasium. He'd blow that silver whistle, a sound that still grates on my nerves today, and point a thick finger. "Van Zant! Rossington! Get over here," he'd bark. "I've seen girls with shorter hair than you freaks. Get it cut by tomorrow or don't bother coming back." He sent us to the office more times than I can count. Every suspension was a badge of honour, but it was also a pain in the ass. We wanted to be in school just enough to see our friends and stay out of trouble with our parents, but Skynyrd made it a daily war of attrition. He was relentless. He'd walk the hallways like he was patrolling a prison yard, looking for any sign of rebellion. That's when we got creative. We were desperate to keep our rock and roll look for the weekend gigs at the local dances, but we had to survive Skynyrd's inspections during the week. I got an idea. I told Gary one morning in the locker room, pulling a blue jar out of my bag. Vaseline. We started greasing our hair down, slicking it back so tightly against our scalps that we looked like we'd been dipped in oil. We'd tuck the ends under our shirt collars and plaster the sides down until we looked like respectable young men from the 1950s. It felt disgusting. The grease would melt in the Florida heat and run down our necks. Smelling like a damn pharmacy. It worked. For a while. At least. Skynyrd would walk past us in the hall, squinting his eyes, sensing something was wrong but unable to prove that our hair was actually 3 inches longer than the rules allowed. We'd smirk at him, our heads glistening under the fluorescent lights, a silent screw you hidden beneath the pomade. But you can't hide the truth forever. Eventually, the grease wasn't enough, or Skynyrd got smarter. One afternoon, he caught Gary. He didn't just send him to the office. He made it personal. The constant harassment, the phone calls to our parents, the threats of expulsion, it was a systematic attempt to break our spirits. He wanted us to conform. He wanted us to be normal. One evening, after another long, sweltering rehearsal at Hellhouse, we were sitting around, exhausted and fuming about our latest run-in with the man. At the time, we were still calling ourselves the Noble Five or My Backyard, but none of it felt right. Those names didn't have teeth. They didn't have the grit of the West Side. "I'm sick of that man," Gary spat, rubbing his neck where the Vaseline had caused a rash. "Skinner this, Skinner that. He's obsessed with us." I looked at the guys, and a wicked thought started to form in my mind. It was the kind of idea that comes from Van Zant's instinct for a counterpunch. If you can't beat the man, you become the man. You take his power, and you wear it like a trophy. "What if we call ourselves Lynyrd Skynyrd?" I said. The words tasted like a cold beer on a hot day. There was a moment of stunned silence. Then Bob started laughing. "You're kidding, right? We're going to name our band after the guy who tries to kick us out of school every day?" "Exactly." I leaned forward, my eyes narrowing. "Every time a radio announcer says our name, they'll be saying his name. Every time a fan screams it, they're screaming for us, but using his identity. We'll take his name to the top of the charts and make it stand for the very thing he hates most: loud, long-haired, rebellious Southern rock." We tweaked the spelling to avoid a direct lawsuit, changing a few vowels to make it Lynyrd Skynyrd, but the intent was pure spite. It was a permanent middle finger to the man with the whistle. It was our way of saying that you can try to cut our hair, you can try to break our spirit, but you will never control our sound. From that day on, we weren't just a band. We were a living irony. We took the name of the man who represented the system and turned it into the anthem of the outcasts. Skinner became our unwilling mascot. We even ended up calling him years later, once we made it big, to invite him to a show. I think he finally realised the joke was on him, but by then, the name was bigger than the man. It belonged to the world. Looking back, Skinner was the best thing that ever happened to us. Without his petty rules and his constant hounding, we might have stayed the Noble Five and faded into the humid Jacksonville nights. He gave us a common enemy. He gave us a reason to be defiant. He gave us a name that sounded like a punch in the gut and a howl in the dark. In the end, I realised that every great story needs a villain. Lynyrd Skynyrd thought he was clipping our wings, but all he did was teach us how to sharpen our claws. We didn't just take his name. We took his authority and set it on fire with 3 lead guitars. Whenever I stand on stage now and hear 10,000 people chant that name, I don't think of a gym teacher in a flat top. I think of the victory of the misfits. We turned his no into our yes, and in doing so, we made sure that Lynyrd Skynyrd would never, ever be forgotten, though not for the reasons he hoped. There is a thin line between integrity and insanity, and in 1970, everyone in Jacksonville thought I'd crossed it. I had a contract from Capricorn Records in my hand, the holy grail for any Southern musician, and I looked the man in the eye and told him to shove it. My bandmates looked at me like I'd just set our only getaway car on fire. But I knew something they didn't. We weren't ready to be legends yet. We were still just bar fighters with guitars, and if we went to the big leagues too early, we'd be chewed up and spat out before we ever wrote a song that mattered. The year 1970 was supposed to be our breakthrough. We had the name, Lynyrd Skynyrd, and we had a reputation that was starting to leak out of the Florida Panhandle. Capricorn Records was the centre of the universe back then, the home of the Allman Brothers. Getting an offer from them was like being invited to the high table. But when I sat down and looked at the terms, and more importantly, when I looked at where we were as a band, my gut turned cold. They wanted to rush us. They wanted to mould us. And I realised that if we signed that paper, we'd just be the younger, scruffier version of the Allmans. I didn't want to be anyone's little brother. "We're passing," I told the guys in the dim light of a roadside diner. The silence that followed was heavier than a humid night in the swamp. Gary Rossington looked like he'd been punched in the throat. Bob Burns just stared at his coffee. We were broke. We were playing for gas money and free beer. And here I was, turning down the only life raft in sight. "Are you out of your mind, Ronnie?" someone hissed. "We're eating bologna and sleeping in the van. This was the exit." I slammed my hand on the table, making the silverware rattle. "It's a trap, not an exit. We sign that now. We belong to them. We spend 3 more years in the bars, and we belong to ourselves. We need to be so good that when the next man comes calling, he doesn't offer us a deal, he begs us to take his money. Now, get in the van. And so began our 3 years in the wilderness. 3 years of being the best band that nobody knew. We became ghosts of the Southern Highway. We played every dive bar, every VFW hall, and every chicken wire enclosed stage, from Jacksonville to Muscle Shoals. We were the working man's band, and that meant working harder than anyone else. I'd drive the van for 8 hours straight, the headlights cutting through the Georgia fog, while the rest of the boys slept on top of amplifier cases. My eyes would burn from the caffeine and the road glare, but I'd just grip the wheel and think about Lacy's truck. If you haven't bled for it, don't put it in a verse. The bars were our real Hellhouse. These weren't places where people came to appreciate art. They came to forget their wives, find a fight, or get blind drunk. We played in places where the floors were so sticky you'd lose a boot if you stood still too long. I've seen bottles fly past my head that were meant for the guy in the front row, and I've had to jump off stage more than once to finish a fight that a fan started with Alan or Gary. But those 3 years did something to us that a record deal never could. They made us bulletproof. When you play 4 sets a night to a room full of bikers and sailors who want to hear nothing but Proud Mary, you learn how to command a room. You learn how to make your instruments roar louder than the drunkest heckler. I became a tyrant of discipline. If Gary missed a note because he was looking at a girl, I'd pull him aside and let him know that the music was the only lady that mattered. If Bob drifted on the tempo, he'd feel my eyes burning into the back of his head. We were growing up in the shadows. We were writing songs like Gimme 3 Steps, songs born from real moments where I almost got my head blown off in a bar called the West Shore for dancing with the wrong man's woman. We weren't singing about California dreams. We were singing about the dirt we were standing in. I remember one night, in a particularly rough spot in Alabama. We had played for 5 hours. My voice was a shredded mess of vocal cords and whiskey. We were packing the gear into the van at 3 a.m. in the pouring rain. Everyone was shivering, exhausted, and wondering if I was still crazy for turning down Capricorn 3 years prior. I stood there, soaked to the bone, looking at the neon sign of the bar flickering out. I felt a strange sense of peace. My Mississippi Kid prophecy was humming in my ears. I knew our time was coming. We weren't the scrawny kids from Robert E. Lee High anymore. We were a lean, mean, 3-guitar machine that could outplay anyone on the planet. You hear that? I asked Gary as he lugged a heavy Marshall cab toward the door. Hear what, Ronnie? Just the rain, man. No, I smiled, the rain dripping off my hat. I hear the sound of a band that's ready. We didn't need Capricorn. We had the bars, we had the miles, and we had the truth. We had spent 3 years in the shadows, but all that did was make us crave the light even more. When Al Cooper eventually found us in a club called Finocchio's in Atlanta a few years later, he didn't find a band looking for a break. He found a band that was ready to take over the world. Those 3 years taught me that the hardest road is usually the right one. By refusing to be just another band, we became the band. We traded a quick paycheck for a permanent legacy. I looked at my tired, dirty, brilliant brothers in that rain-soaked parking lot, and I knew. We hadn't just survived the shadows. We had mastered them. We were no longer chasing the music. The music was finally flowing through us like a river of fire. If you ask 1,000 people what freedom sounds like, they'll give you 1,000 different answers. Some will talk about the wind in the trees, others about the roar of a V8 engine on an open highway. But if you play them those opening chords on a slide guitar, that slow, morning prayer of a melody, they'll all point to the same patch of sky. They call it Freebird. To the world, it's a rock anthem. To me, it was a 3-minute miracle that took 10 years of blood to earn. And when I sing it, I do it with my boots off, because you can't feel the lightning of a crowd if you've got dead cow skin between your soul and the stage. The birth of Freebird wasn't some grand, orchestrated event. It didn't happen in a high-tech studio with a dozen producers. It happened in the humid, cramped corners of our early days, born from a simple question and a persistent melody that refused to die. Alan Collins had been playing this chord progression for what felt like an eternity, a slow, haunting series of notes that seemed to hang in the air like Spanish moss in a Florida swamp. For months, I told him to put it away. It's too long, Alan, I'd say, wiped out from a 12-hour rehearsal. Too many chords. People want to dance, not go to a funeral. But one afternoon at Hellhouse, something shifted in the atmosphere. The air was heavy, the kind of Florida heat that makes you feel like you're breathing underwater. We were exhausted, frustrated, and the silence between us was becoming a wall. Alan started playing that riff again, sitting on an old amplifier, his head down. This time, I didn't tell him to stop. Instead, I felt a vibration in my chest, like a freight train coming from a long way off. I grabbed a crumpled notepad and a pencil stub. The lyrics didn't come from my brain. They felt like they were being whispered to me by the ghosts of the road itself. If I leave here tomorrow, would you still remember me? I wrote the entire lyric in 3 minutes. Just 3 minutes to capture a lifetime of restless travel, the guilt of leaving people behind, and the heartbreaking reality of being a man who belongs to the highway more than he belongs to any woman or home. It was the story of every truck driver I'd seen in my father, Lacy's cab, staring at the white lines until they went blind. It was the story of my own life. When we finished that first rough run-through, the silence in that rotting shack was different. No one spoke. We knew we hadn't just written a song, we had captured a soul. People always ask me, Ronnie, why do you perform barefoot? Don't you worry about the splinters, the rusty nails, or getting fried by an electric shock? I just laugh and spit. They don't get it, because they weren't raised with their toes in the Florida dirt. Barefoot is how I stayed grounded when the world started spinning too fast. When I stand on that stage, looking out at 20,000 faces, I need to be connected to something real. I want to feel the vibration of Leon's bass guitar rattling the floorboards beneath my feet. I want to feel the heat radiating from the stage lights. It's a ritual, a way of stripping away the rock star bullshit. When I kick off those boots, I'm not a celebrity. I'm just Ronnie, the kid from the West Side, the son of a prizefighter, standing raw and honest before the people. If I'm going to tell them the truth about my life, I have to be as close to the earth as possible. I want to feel the splinters. I want to feel the struggle. There's a specific kind of magic that happens when we play Freebird live, a transition that I can only describe as a religious experience. It usually starts during the quietest part of the set. I'll see a single lighter flicker in the back of the arena, then another, until the whole place looks like a sea of fallen stars. Then comes the shout. It's never a polite request, it's a primal scream. Freebird! When I hear that roar, my spirit shifts. I look at Gary and Alan, and I see them transform. We start that slow, mournful ballad, and I can feel the collective breath of the crowd hitch. But then, we hit the turn. That slow prayer builds and builds, the tension mounting until it explodes into that triple guitar frenzy, a sonic hurricane of 3 lead guitars weaving in and out of each other like lightning bolts. In those moments, I'm not just a singer, I'm a witness to something bigger than all of us. I've seen grown men, tough guys with tattoos and scars, close their eyes and weep during that solo. I've seen women reach out as if they could touch the notes in the air. There's a connection there that goes beyond entertainment. It's a shared understanding of the Southern condition, the desire to be wild, the pain of being lost, and the desperate, aching need to fly away from whatever cage the world has built for you. For 10 minutes, every person in that building is free. I remember a night in a packed stadium in California. The wind was whipping across the stage, and the smell of marijuana and sweat was thick enough to choke a horse. We started the intro, and the silence that fell over 60,000 people was more powerful than the loudest drum roll. I stood at the edge of the stage, my bare toes curled over the lip of the wood, looking out at that massive human ocean. I realised right then that Freebird didn't belong to the band anymore. It was a public utility. It belonged to the veteran who just got home, the kid who felt like a freak in his own town, and the man who was tired of being told what to do. Every time I sing those words, I feel the weight of Lacy's hand on my shoulder. I can hear him saying, "Don't sing no lies." So I don't. I sing that song like it's the last thing I'll ever say. I sing it with the knowledge that one day I will leave here tomorrow. I sing it for the freedom I found in the music and for the price I had to pay to get it. Sometimes, as the guitars are screaming toward that final, chaotic crescendo and the white lights are blinding me, I lose track of where I am. I'm not in a stadium. I'm back on the porch of Hellhouse or in the passenger seat of my father's truck, listening to the radio. I feel like I'm rising. I feel like I'm actually leaving the ground. I feel like that bird caught in a high wind, finally finding the slipstream that leads out of the darkness and into the light. The song is long, yeah. It's too many chords, like I told Alan, but you can't rush the truth. You can't hurry a man's escape from his own life. We play it until there's nothing left in our lungs or our fingers. We play it until the air itself feels like it's on fire. Writing Freebird in 3 minutes wasn't a matter of luck. It was the result of a lifetime of being told I couldn't fly. When I stand barefoot on that stage, stripped of my pride and my boots, I am as vulnerable and as powerful as I will ever be. That song is the bridge between the dirt road boy I was and the legend they say I've become. We gave the world a way to fly, a way to scream back at the wind. And in that roar of the crowd, I finally found the peace that the road had been trying to steal from me. Don't let the long hair and the lyrics about freedom fool you. I am not a hippie. I don't believe in peace and love when it comes to the survival of this band. I am the son of Lacy Van Zant, and I run Lynyrd Skynyrd the only way a man from the West Side knows how, with an iron fist and a zero-tolerance policy for weakness. In this business, you're either a professional or you're a casualty. I'd rather be the devil in the dressing room than watch my brothers become a joke on the stage. People see us on stage, 3 guitars roaring in perfect harmony, and they think it's effortless. They think we just rolled out of bed, drank a bottle of Jack Daniels, and wandered into the spotlight. That is a lie. That precision, the way Gary, Alan, and Ed weave those melodies together without stepping on each other's toes, is bought with blood. And I'm the one who collects the debt. I've been called a tyrant, a bully, and the scariest frontman in rock and roll. I don't mind those titles. If being scary is what it takes to keep this band from rotting from the inside out, then I'll be the monster under the bed every damn night. My philosophy is simple. When we are on that clock, we belong to the music. Not to the whiskey, not to the pills, and sure as hell not to the girls in the front row. I've seen too many great bands go down in flames because they let their egos and their addictions get louder than their instruments. I won't let that happen to Skynyrd. Not while there's breath in my lungs. I remember a night in a sweat-soaked club during our early tours. We were halfway through the set and I noticed the tempo was dragging. I looked back at the kit, then at the guitars. Gary was leaning against his amp, his eyes glazed over, staring at some blonde girl near the stage instead of watching my cues. He was playing sloppily, hitting blue notes that had no business being in a Skynyrd song. The second the curtain fell, I didn't wait for the applause to die down. I cornered him in the dressing room before he could even set his Les Paul down. "What the hell was that, Gary?" I hissed, my pulse pounding in my temples. "Cool it, Ronnie. It was just one set." I didn't let him finish. I threw a punch that landed right on his jaw. It wasn't about hate, it was about calibration. I watched him hit the floor, the shock in his eyes replacing the drunken fog. The room went silent. The roadies stopped moving. The rest of the band held their breath. "The people out there paid their hard-earned money to see a world-class band," I said, towering over him, my knuckles throbbing. "If you want to look at girls, go to a strip club. If you want to get drunk, do it on your own time. But when you are on my stage, you play like your life depends on it, because mine does." I walked out and left him there. The next night, he played the best set of his life. It's a heavy burden being the one everyone fears. I love these guys. Gary, Alan, Leon, they're my brothers. I'd take a bullet for any of them. But I'd also give them a black eye to save them from themselves. I've seen the way the road tempts you. It offers you everything that can kill you and whispers that you're invincible. I have to be the voice of reality. I have to be the one who stays sober enough to spot the cracks in the foundation. There's a reason we don't have jams where everyone just noodles around for 20 minutes. Our songs are structured like a prize fight. Every movement is calculated. Every solo has a beginning, a middle, and an end. I make the boys practice until their fingers are raw and their minds are numb. If someone shows up late to rehearsal, they pay. If someone gets too high to remember the bridge of a new track, they answer to me. I've had to be the executioner more than once. When Bob Burns started losing his grip on reality, when the pressure of the road and the chemicals started turning his drumming into a chaotic mess, I had to make the call. It broke my heart to let him go. He was there from the very beginning, back when we were just kids in the yard. But the band is bigger than any one man, even me. I told him he was out. And I didn't blink, even though I felt like I was cutting off my own arm. You're making us look bad, Bob, I told him, my voice flat. And I won't let you sink this ship. The critics call me the scariest frontman, but they don't see the nights I spend awake worrying about these boys. They don't see the weight of the responsibility I carry. I'm the one who negotiates the contracts, the one who handles the promoters, and the one who has to keep the peace when the egos start to clash. I'm the glue, and sometimes glue has to be sticky and uncomfortable to keep things together. I remember a gig where a fan was getting too handsy with Cassie and the Honkettes. The security was doing nothing. I didn't stop the song. I didn't call for help. I handed my mic to the stagehand, jumped off the stage, and handled it myself. I came back up, wiped the blood off my shirt, and finished the verse. That's the code. You protect your own, and you maintain the standard. I'm not looking for friends in this band. I'm looking for legends. I want us to be mentioned in the same breath as the greats, and you don't get there by being nice. You get there by being undeniable. If that means I have to be the devil who screams at them in the studio until we get the perfect take, then I'll wear the horns. If it means I have to knock a drink out of their hands 5 minutes before showtime, then I'm the bad guy. The paradox is that the more I pushed them, the more they trusted me. They knew that if I was hard on them, it was because I believed they were capable of greatness. They knew that I wouldn't ask them to do anything I wouldn't do myself. I'm the first one at the venue and the last one to leave. I'm the one who bleeds the most for every line. Sometimes I see the look in their eyes, a mixture of respect and resentment. It's a lonely place to be at the top of the pyramid. But then we hit that final chord of Simple Man or Gimme 3 Steps, and I feel the power of what we've built. The discipline has paid off. We aren't just a band, we're an institution. We are the voice of the South, and that voice is steady because I refuse to let it shake. At the end of the day, I am not trying to be a dictator. I'm trying to keep us alive. I know the clock is ticking for me. I can feel it in my bones. And if I only have a short time left, I'll be damned if I spend it being part of something mediocre. I'll take the hatred of my brothers if it means they get to be stars. I'll be the Iron Hand so they can be the Freebirds. Because when the music is right, the pain of the discipline fades away, leaving only the truth of the song. If you ever want to see a bunch of British aristocrats and rock royalty choke on their tea, just send a group of long-haired boys from Jacksonville onto their stage. In 1976, we were invited to open for the Rolling Stones at the Knebworth Festival. It was supposed to be their coronation, their grandest moment on a stage shaped like a giant mouth with a protruding tongue. Mick Jagger gave us one rule: stay off the tongue. He might as well have dared me to burn the stadium down. I didn't come all the way from Florida to be a footnote in someone else's biography. I came to show the world that the South wasn't just rising, it was taking over. By 1976, Lynyrd Skynyrd was no longer a bar band. We had the platinum records, the sold-out arenas, and a reputation for being the most dangerous live act on the planet. But in the eyes of the London elite and the big shot promoters, we were still just opening acts. When we got the call for Knebworth, playing before 150,000 people, I knew this was the moment to settle the score. I remember walking into the backstage area and seeing the scale of the production. The Stones had this massive stage, a literal work of art shaped like their iconic logo, a gaping mouth with a red tongue that extended way out into the sea of people. It was designed specifically so Mick could strut out there and be the centre of the universe. Before we went on, a high and mighty stage manager, probably on orders from Jagger himself, pulled me aside. He looked at my worn-out hat and my bare feet with a mix of pity and disgust. "Mr. Van Zant," he said, adjusting his headset. "A word from the Stones camp. You are welcome to the main stage area, but under no circumstances is any member of Lynyrd Skynyrd to set foot on the tongue. That is reserved strictly for Mr. Jagger." I didn't argue. I didn't even yell. I just looked at him, spat a bit of tobacco juice near his expensive boots, and walked back to our dressing room. The boys were there, tuning up, looking a bit nervous at the sheer size of the crowd. "Hey, Ronnie," Gary said, looking at my shirt. "You sure about that?" I was wearing a t-shirt I'd had made specially for the occasion. In bold, unapologetic letters, it read, "Who the F times are the Rolling Stones anyway? Asterisk, Asterisk. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, I told them. Listen to me. Jagger thinks he owns this field. He thinks we're here to warm up his seats. But we're going out there to take his crown. When we hit the solo on Freebird, I don't want anyone standing back. We're going on that tongue. All of us. But they said... Alan started. I don't care what they said, I barked, my iron hand discipline flaring up. We're from Jacksonville. We don't take orders from guys in velvet pants. We're going to walk out on that tongue, and we're going to play so loud they'll hear us back in Florida. If they want to kick us off the tour, let them. But they'll never forget the day Skynyrd showed up. We walked out onto that stage, and the heat from the crowd hit us like a physical wall. 150,000 people. It was a carpet of humanity stretching as far as the eye could see. The Stones fans were sceptical at first, wondering who these scruffy Americans were. We started with Working for MCA, and I could feel the energy shifting. We were tight. We were loud. We were playing with a chip on our shoulders the size of the state of Georgia. Then came the moment. We moved into the finale of the set. The opening notes of Freebird drifted out over the English countryside. The crowd erupted. As the song began to build, as Billy hit the keys and the three guitars started to weave that legendary web of sound, I looked at Gary and Alan. I gave them a sharp nod. I led the way. I walked right past the invisible line the stage manager had drawn. I stepped onto the red fabric of the giant tongue. I felt the spring of the wood beneath my bare feet. I kept walking, further and further out, right into the heart of the audience. Behind me, Gary, Alan, and Steve followed, their guitar cables trailing like umbilical cords of pure electricity. We stood at the very tip of Jagger's tongue, right where he was supposed to have his big moment. We weren't just playing a song, we were staging a coup. I stood there, looking out at the ocean of hands, my shirt screaming my defiance at the VIP tents where the Stones were likely watching in horror. The guitars went into the triple threat solo. It was a dogfight of melody. Alan screaming on the Firebird, Gary wailing on the Les Paul, Steve Gaines showing everyone why I'd brought him into the fold. We stayed out there for the entire 10-minute climax. We owned that tongue. We owned Knebworth. For those 10 minutes, the Rolling Stones didn't exist. There was only Lynyrd Skynyrd. The crowd went absolutely feral. They had come for the legends, but they had found a new religion. When we finally finished and walked off, the silence from the backstage crew was deafening. The stage manager looked like he'd seen a ghost. Mick Jagger was nowhere to be found, but I heard later he was fuming. We had broken the cardinal rule of rock hierarchy, never upstage the headliner on their own gimmick. As we reached the dressing room, the adrenaline was still humming in my veins. The boys were grinning ear to ear, realising what we'd just done. We had walked into the lion's den and pulled the lion's tail. We're probably banned for life, aren't we? Leon asked, cracking a beer. Most likely. I laughed, wiping the sweat from my forehead. But did you see their faces? They didn't think a bunch of rednecks could play like that. They thought they could put us in a box and tell us where to stand. But a bird you cannot change, right? That shirt. Who the fuck it are the Rolling Stones anyway? Became a piece of history. It wasn't about hating the Stones. I respected their music. It was about respect. It was about the fact that no matter how big you think you are, you don't get to tell Ronnie Van Zant where he can and can't walk. I brought the spirit of the West Side to Knebworth, and I didn't leave until I'd left my footprints all over their ego. We never performed with Jagger or the Stones again. They made sure of that. But I didn't care. We didn't need their blessing. We had proven that we could stand toe-to-toe with the biggest band in the world and come out on top. We were the kings of the South, and for one glorious afternoon in England, we were the kings of the world. Knebworth wasn't just a concert. It was a declaration of independence. By stepping onto that tongue, I told my band and the world that we bow to no one. We had come from the dirt of Hellhouse to the heights of European stardom, and we did it without compromising an inch of who we were. I looked at my brothers and knew that from that day on, no one would ever doubt the power of Lynyrd Skynyrd. We weren't just an opening act. We were the storm that the Stones couldn't contain. Some men spend their lives building cathedrals, planning for a retirement they'll never enjoy and a legacy they'll never see. Me? I've spent my life looking over my shoulder at a shadow that's been gaining on me since I was a kid in Jacksonville. I've always known that my time on this earth was a short-term lease. I told my father, I told my wife, and I told my brothers, I'm never going to see 30. It wasn't a guess, and it wasn't a play for sympathy. It was a cold, hard fact, as certain as the sunrise over the St. John's River. When you live with a ghost tapping on your window every night, you don't waste time on trivialities. You sing like you're already half gone. There is a weight to the air in the south, a kind of humidity that carries the whispers of the dead. Growing up, I developed what my mother called the second sight. It's a gift, or maybe a curse, that lets you see the ending of the movie before the opening credits are even finished. People think I'm morbid, but I call it being a realist. My father, Lack, he taught me how to survive a fight, but no one can teach you how to survive fate. I started calling myself the Mississippi Kid a few years back. People got confused. Ronnie, you're a Florida boy through and through, they'd say. Why the hell are you claiming Mississippi? I just smiled and kept my mouth shut, but the truth was in my gut. I felt a pull toward that state, toward the dark soil, the Delta blues, and the heavy silence of its woods. I knew with a bone-deep certainty that Mississippi was where my story would reach its final verse. I wasn't claiming the state. I was acknowledging my graveyard. As I approached 29, the feeling intensified. It wasn't a loud, screaming fear. It was more like a low-frequency hum, the kind you hear from a power line right before it snaps. I began to settle my affairs without even realizing I was doing it. I'd look at my wife, Judy, and our little girl, and my heart would ache with a kind of preemptive grief. I'd hold them a little tighter, stay a little longer in the doorway before heading out on tour, because I knew the Freebird was finally getting ready to fly. Don't talk like that, Ronnie, Judy would say when I'd mention not making it to 30. You've got decades left. You're at the top of the world. The top of the world is a long way to fall, honey, I'd reply, staring out at the Florida pines. I can feel the clock. The gears are grinding down. I started seeing signs everywhere. In the lyrics I wrote, in the way the wind sounded through the cypress trees, and in the faces of the people I loved. I became even more of a tyrant with the band. If my time was short, then every note had to be perfect. Every show had to be the one they'd talk about for 100 years. I was running a race against a phantom, and I was losing ground every single day. I remember sitting in a hotel room in 1977, staring at a calendar. My 30th birthday was just months away. October was looming like a dark cloud on the horizon. I'd look in the mirror and see the lines around my eyes, the wear and tear of 1,000 bars and 10,000 miles, and I'd think, is this it? Is this all the time I get? But strangely, with that realization came a profound sense of peace. When you stop fighting the inevitable, you find a clarity that most people never touch. I stopped caring about the critics. I stopped caring about the feuds with other bands. I focused entirely on the truth. I wanted to leave behind a map, a musical legacy that would tell every working man out there that his life mattered, that his struggle was seen, and that his voice deserved to be heard. I'd tell the guys, live it up now, boys. This ride doesn't last forever. They thought I was just being scary Ronnie, being dramatic to keep them on their toes. But Gary would sometimes catch me, staring off into nothing, and I'd see a flash of understanding in his eyes. He knew I wasn't acting. He knew I was listening to a song that only I could hear. I found myself drawn to the water more than ever. I'd go out on my boat, drop a line in the water, and just listen to the silence. The fish didn't care about platinum records or Knebworth. They just existed. I felt a kinship with them, with the simple, brutal reality of nature. I knew that soon enough, I'd be part of that cycle again. I wasn't afraid of the dirt. I was a Van Zant. I was born from it. The prophecy of the Mississippi Kid started to feel less like a threat and more like an invitation. I'd close my eyes and see the tall grass of the Delta. I'd hear the whistle of a train in the distance. I knew that my Mississippi wasn't just a place on a map. It was the transition. It was the moment I'd finally be truly free. People ask why I didn't try to change it. Why not stay home? Why not stop the tour? But that's not how it works. You don't outrun fate by hiding in a basement. You meet it head on, with your chin up and your boots off. If I were meant to go down in Mississippi, then that's where I was going to be, singing my heart out until the very last second. I remember a conversation with my brother Johnny. He was so young, so full of life. I looked at him and felt a passing of the torch. "Johnny," I said, "take care of Mum and Pop. And remember, the music is the only thing that stays. Everything else, the fame, the money, the fast cars, it's just dust in the wind." He looked at me like I was talking in riddles. "You're fine, Ronnie. You're the king. Kings fall to little brother. Just make sure you know the words when it's your turn to sing." Now, as we prepare for this next leg of the tour, as we load the gear onto that plane, I feel the hum getting louder. It's almost a roar now. I look at the calendar. October 1977. I'm 29 years old. I've lived 3 lifetimes in those 29 years. I've seen the world, I've felt the love of a million strangers, and I've turned my father's fists into a symphony. If the Mississippi Kid has to pay the tab now, I can't complain. I've had a hell of a run. The shadows are long, the air is thick, and the plane is waiting. I'm not scared. I'm just ready to see what's on the other side of the clouds. Acceptance is the ultimate form of rebellion. By embracing my end, I took away its power to terrify me. I realised that my life wasn't measured by its length, but by its depth. I had become the voice I heard on Lacy's radio, the one that speaks the truth about the pain and the beauty of the human condition. I might not see 30, but I will live forever in the notes of a slide guitar and the hearts of the outcasts. I am the Mississippi Kid, and I am finally going home. There is a silence unlike anything else in this world. It's the silence of a 10-ton piece of machinery losing its heartbeat at 10,000 feet. It's not the peace of a quiet morning in the Florida swamps. It's the scream of physics reclaiming what belongs to the earth. On the 20th of October 1977, the Mississippi sky stopped being a prophecy for the Mississippi Kid and became my reality. I had spent years telling anyone who would listen that I wouldn't see 30. As the fuel gauges hit empty and the cockpit went dark, I didn't feel shock. I felt the click of a lock, finally finding its key. Just 87 days before that flight, I was standing on a stage in the middle of a summer tour, feeling the roar of a sold-out crowd and the heat of the spotlights. We had just released Street Survivors. We were at the absolute peak of the mountain we had spent 10 years climbing. But the air at the top was thin, and the omens were everywhere. That album cover, showing us standing in the middle of a street engulfed in flames, wasn't just a design choice, it was a premonition. I looked at that image and felt a cold shiver. We were survivors, sure, but the street was starting to burn. The morning of the 20th in Greenville, South Carolina, felt heavy, like the atmosphere was trying to tell us to stay on the ground. We were headed for Baton Rouge, Louisiana, on a chartered Convair CV-240. The moment I saw that plane, I knew it was a piece of junk held together by spit and prayers. It was an old bird, coughing out sparks and groaning in its joints. Cassie Gaines was terrified. She saw the flames spitting from the engine on a previous leg and wanted to ride in the equipment truck. I looked at her, and I felt that Iron Hand discipline rise one last time. I didn't want the band to fracture. I didn't want the fear to take hold. "If it's your time, Cassie," I told her. It's a sentence that has haunted me every second since. I ushered my brothers onto that plane, leading them into the clouds like I'd led them into the bars of Jacksonville and onto the stage at Knebworth. Midway through the flight, the mechanical cough turned into a death rattle. The right engine gave out first, then the left. The sudden drop in altitude felt like the floor had been pulled out from under my feet. Inside the cabin, the world went mad. I saw my brothers, the men I'd bled with in Hellhouse, scrambling for cover. People were crying, praying to a god they hadn't spoken to in years, and bracing for the impact. But as I sat there, I felt a strange, crystalline calm. I looked out the window at the endless expanse of Mississippi pine trees rushing up to meet us. This was it. The Mississippi Kid was finally coming home to the state he'd claimed in his songs. I got up from my seat. I walked down the aisle one last time, my bare feet steady on the tilting carpet. I checked on the boys. I grabbed Gary's hand and looked him in the eye. We didn't need a 3-minute lyric to say what needed to be said. Everything, the fists, the whiskey, the 3 guitar harmonies, it was all there in that final look. I tightened my seatbelt, pulled my black hat low over my eyes, and braced myself. I wasn't scared of the dark. I was just sad I wouldn't get to see my little girl grow up, or tell Judy I loved her one more time. "Hold on tight, boys," I yelled over the whistle of the wind through the fuselage. "This is going to be a rough landing." The crash didn't sound like an explosion. It sounded like a giant tearing a forest in half. I heard the scream of metal against cypress wood, the sickening crunch of the cockpit being crushed, and the roar of the trees shattering as they tore through the wings. I felt my body being thrown forward with a violence that no human frame was built to endure. The pain was a blinding white flash, and then the lights went out, just like the end of the encore on the best night of my life. I died at 29 years old. I was just months away from that 30th birthday I'd spent my life running from. I lay there in the thick, muddy undergrowth of the Galesburg swamp, my heart finally finding the silence I'd been fighting since Jacksonville. There were no cameras, no lighters in the air, no barefoot stage to walk on. Just the hum of the Mississippi mosquitoes and the stillness of the deep woods. The plane ran out of fuel, but my story didn't. I died exactly how I lived, at full throttle, surrounded by my brothers, refusing to back down from the inevitable. I didn't die a tired old man in a bed. I died as the leader of the greatest band the South had ever seen. I went out as a street survivor, even if the street finally claimed me. In those final seconds of freefall, I realised that Lacy's lessons in the backyard weren't just about taking a punch from a man, they were about taking the final punch from life itself. I didn't close my eyes in fear, I closed them in acceptance. I had turned my life into a song that would never stop playing. I died as I was born, restless and free. Mississippi took my body, but the world kept my voice. The Mississippi Kid reached his destination, and for the first time in 29 years, the engine was finally quiet. They say that when a Southern man dies, he doesn't just go to heaven, he goes back into the soil, the songs, and the stories of the people who loved him. I lived my life at 100 miles an hour, always knowing the road would end abruptly in a tangle of metal and moss. But I thought that once the music stopped and the dirt was shoveled over me, I'd finally find the one thing I never had on the road: peace. I was wrong. Even in death, the world wouldn't leave Ronnie Van Zant alone. But you can steal a man's bones, and you can vandalise his grave, but you can't kill a melody that's etched into the soul of a nation. The day they laid me to rest in Jacksonville, the city stood still. It was a hot October day, the kind where the humidity makes the air feel like a damp blanket. Thousands of people lined the streets, men in work shirts, bikers with tears streaming down their faces, and kids who looked just like I did when I was sitting in Lacy's truck. They didn't come to see a rock star, they came to say goodbye to a brother. Inside the casket, I was exactly who I had always been. No flashy suits, no diamond rings. My family dressed me in my favourite clothes. They placed my trademark black hat on my head, the one that had shielded my eyes from 1,000 spotlights. And right next to me, they tucked in my favourite fishing pole. It was a simple message to the world. I was done singing, and I was going fishing. I was finally heading to that quiet pond where the fish always bite, and the radio never cuts to static. The funeral was a chorus of grief. People were literally falling down, overcome by the weight of the loss. When the music played, it wasn't a hymn. It was the sound of a legacy. As they lowered me into the Florida earth, I think everyone felt that the heart of the South had just skipped a beat. For a while, the silence was absolute. The band was broken, the leader was gone, and it felt like Lynyrd Skynyrd was a book that had been slammed shut at the most exciting chapter. But as the years turned into decades, a strange and ugly thing happened. In late June of 2000, long after I'd settled into the rhythm of the earth, some dark souls decided that my story hadn't suffered enough. Vandals broke into my tomb. They exhumed my casket and breached the sanctity of my rest. They were looking for something, a souvenir, a piece of the legend, or maybe they just wanted to see if the Mississippi Kid really was still wearing that hat. It was a violation that tore open the old wounds of my family. My brothers, my wife, my daughter, They had to endure the horror of moving my remains to an unmarked, secure location just so I could have the peace I'd earned. It was a reminder that even in the grave, the iron hand of my discipline was still needed to protect what was ours. People treat legends like public property, forgetting that underneath the black hat there was just a man who wanted to go home. Yet, out of that darkness and the wreckage of the 1977 crash, something miraculous happened. A decade after the plane went down, the surviving members decided the silence had lasted long enough. They looked for a voice that could carry the weight of my lyrics without trying to mimic my ghost, and they found it in the only place they could. My younger brother, Johnny. I remember watching him from wherever it is I am now. He stepped up to that microphone, looking so much like me that it made the world gasp. He took my place, but he never tried to be me. He sang for the family, for the fans, and for the brothers we lost in that swamp. When he leads the crowd in Sweet Home Alabama, I can feel the vibration through the ground. He kept the fire burning when it should have gone out. But there is a truth that even Johnny knows. The soul of the original Lynyrd Skynyrd will forever be 29 years old. It's frozen in time, sitting barefoot on a stage in 1977, smelling of whiskey and swamp water, challenging the world to a fight it can't win. We are the ghost in the machine, the echo in the rafters of every arena. The legacy isn't in the gold records or the Hall of Fame trophies. It's in the kid today who picks up a guitar because he's angry at the world. It's in the working man who turns up the volume on his truck radio because Simple Man reminds him that he's enough. It's in the defiance of the Southern spirit that refuses to be told where to walk or how to sing. I am Ronnie Van Zant. I was a son, a brother, a father, and a tyrant. I was the Mississippi kid who died in the woods but lived in the airwaves. My body was moved, my peace was stolen, and my flight was cut short, but the free bird is still flying. And as long as someone, somewhere, is shouting my name at the top of their lungs, I'll never truly be dead. I'm going to go cast my line now. The water is smooth, the sun is setting, and for the first time in forever, I don't have to worry about the next gig. The greatest victory of my life wasn't Knebworth or the platinum hits. It was the fact that I left behind a spirit that couldn't be buried. My brother Johnny carries the torch, but the light belongs to all of us. I died at 29 so that the music could live forever, unchanged and uncompromised. I am finally a free bird, and the view from up here is exactly what I thought it would be.